"You're about to spend the most expensive afternoon of your life," I told the HOA president as the first police cruiser rolled to a stop behind my truck, but she only laughed and folded her arms like she had already won. The blue and red lights bounced across the polished windows of the clubhouse, turning the white columns into flashing stripes while curious neighbors drifted onto their porches with coffee mugs in hand. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the sharp scent of asphalt warming under the Texas sun, and somewhere behind me an automatic sprinkler hissed across a perfectly trimmed lawn. Melissa Crawford stood on the clubhouse steps wearing a pressed white blazer, holding a clipboard against her chest like it was a badge. "Officer," she said before anyone even asked a question, "this man has been trespassing on private HOA property all morning and refuses to identify himself as a resident." I looked at the two officers walking toward me with calm expressions that told me they had probably answered a dozen neighborhood disputes before lunch. One rested a hand lightly on his duty belt while the other pulled out a small notebook. "Sir," the older officer said politely, "do you live in this community?" I smiled just enough to be respectful. "No," I answered. Melissa's grin widened instantly. "See? I told you." He admitted it. The officer nodded once before asking, "Then why are you here today?" I reached into my jacket slowly, not for a wallet or a driver's license, but for a plain white envelope that never left my side. I looked down at it for a second before sliding it back into the inside pocket without opening it. "I have business here," I replied. Melissa actually laughed this time, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Business? You were told twice to leave. This clubhouse is reserved for HOA members only." I shrugged. "That's true." Her confidence became almost theatrical. She pointed toward the parking lot as though directing traffic. "Then leave before you make this worse." I could hear whispers spreading across the sidewalks. Someone muttered that I must be a contractor. Another guessed I was trying to sell something. Nobody recognized me, which was exactly how I wanted it. 6 months of paperwork had taught me that the quietest people usually knew the most. Arguments create headlines. Documents create consequences. The younger officer glanced between Melissa and me, clearly wondering why I looked more patient than nervous. "Sir," he asked again, "is there a reason you keep saying you're not a member?" I nodded. "Because I'm not." Melissa stepped forward before I could continue. "Then he has no legal reason to remain on this property." I met her eyes for the first time that morning. "Actually," I said, "that's where you're mistaken." She shook her head, completely certain that every person standing there was about to watch me walk away in embarrassment. She had no idea the envelope in my pocket contained signatures recorded at the county courthouse less than 48 hours earlier. She had no idea the transaction had already closed before she dialed 911. And she definitely had no idea that by the end of the day, every person inside that clubhouse would discover they had just called the police on the man who now owned the building they were standing in. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you judged me by the pickup truck I drove or the faded work boots I wore, you would probably guess I spent my days fixing warehouses instead of buying them. That assumption had made me a very successful investor. My father spent 32 years as an electrician, and my mother worked the front desk at a small medical clinic. Neither of them believed in shortcuts. They believed in showing up early, keeping promises, and reading every page before signing anything. My father used to slide contracts across our old kitchen table after dinner, tapping the smallest paragraphs with his calloused finger before saying, "The expensive part is never written in big letters." I never forgot that lesson. While some people chase quick profits, I built my business one neglected commercial property at a time. Old shopping centers, forgotten office buildings, storage facilities that banks wanted off their books. Most people saw abandoned brick and cracked parking lots. I saw paperwork waiting to be understood. Every deal began the same way. Long nights inside county record offices. The smell of old paper and printer toner. The quiet clicking of computer keyboards while everyone else hurried home. I learned that fortunes rarely changed hands because of luck. They changed hands because somebody stopped reading on page 12 while somebody else kept going until page 200. 6 months before that police cruiser pulled into the neighborhood, I received a phone call from a regional bank that was quietly liquidating distressed commercial assets. The portfolio was not glamorous. Several small office buildings, a maintenance warehouse, a leased community facility. Most investors ignored it because the numbers looked ordinary at first glance. I asked for every lease, every amendment, every payment history, and every recorded filing connected to the package. My attorney joked that I read legal documents the way other people read mystery novels. Maybe he was right, because buried inside that stack was one property that immediately caught my attention. The address looked familiar. I drove out the following weekend without telling anyone why. Families walked their dogs along clean sidewalks. Children rode bicycles around a landscaped fountain. Everything looked polished, organized, and carefully maintained. At the center of the neighborhood stood a beautiful clubhouse with white columns, brick walls, and a freshly painted sign. The parking lot was full even on a Saturday morning. I stayed inside my truck for almost 20 minutes, watching people come and go while making notes. Nobody noticed me. Nobody had any reason to. They thought they owned certainty. What they actually owned was a lease. That difference would eventually matter more than anyone imagined. I completed the purchase after weeks of inspections, financial reviews, and recorded filings. Once the county confirmed the transfer, my attorney simply smiled across the conference table and slid the closing documents toward me. "Congratulations," he said. "Everything is officially yours." I signed my name, shook his hand, placed every original document into a plain white envelope, and locked it inside my briefcase. I did not celebrate. I did not announce the purchase online. I did not call the management company or introduce myself to the neighborhood. Experience had taught me that people reveal far more about themselves when they believe nobody important is watching. Sometimes the truth arrives with flashing lights. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard. Either way, patience almost always collects the evidence before justice ever collects the signatures. Melissa Crawford had mastered the rare talent of making ordinary neighborhood rules sound like federal law. She had been president of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for almost 7 years, and somewhere along the way she stopped acting like an elected volunteer and started behaving like the owner of every driveway, mailbox, and flower bed inside the community. She drove a pearl white luxury sport utility vehicle that always seemed freshly detailed, parked in the reserved spot beside the clubhouse, and walked through the neighborhood carrying the same leather clipboard I had seen that morning. Residents smiled when she approached, but the smiles disappeared the moment she walked away. It took only a few visits for me to understand why. Every conversation seemed to end with a reminder about rules, approvals, fines, or violations. A basketball hoop was too visible from the street. A pickup truck had remained in a driveway overnight. A mailbox needed repainting because the white color was apparently one shade too warm. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Confidence can be louder than shouting when nobody challenges it. During my second quiet visit to the neighborhood, I watched her stop an elderly man watering his front yard. She measured the distance between 2 decorative flower pots with a tape measure she pulled from her purse, then handed him a printed notice explaining that his landscaping no longer matched community standards. The poor man apologized before she even finished speaking. He thanked her for pointing out the problem. As she walked away, his shoulders dropped like someone had quietly removed all the air from the morning. That was the moment I realized the real currency inside this neighborhood was not money. It was intimidation dressed up as procedure. A week later, I returned just before sunset and parked across from the clubhouse again. Through the large front windows, I could see the monthly board meeting beginning. Melissa stood at the front of the room beside a projection screen displaying charts about community compliance. Every few minutes, she pointed toward another slide, while board members nodded almost automatically. Residents who asked questions were interrupted with references to bylaws and legal authority. Nobody appeared willing to ask a second question. I stayed outside, listening only to muffled voices drifting through the glass whenever the entrance door opened. The smell of fresh coffee floated into the parking lot each time another homeowner stepped inside, carrying paperwork that looked more like tax documents than neighborhood newsletters. Before leaving, I noticed something else. The property management company logo printed across every agenda matched the same corporate name listed throughout the closing documents sitting inside my office safe. That detail made me smile because it confirmed I had not misunderstood a single page during due diligence. Melissa believed the management company answered to her. The management company believed its lease protected its future. Neither of them realized ownership had already changed hands. They were still operating inside yesterday's reality, while tomorrow had already been recorded at the county courthouse. I never interrupted their routine. I never introduced myself. People reveal their true character when they believe the audience has no authority. Melissa kept building that illusion one confident decision at a time, never realizing every unnecessary threat, every exaggerated claim of power, and every public display of certainty was quietly becoming part of a story that would soon reach a very different ending than the one she had planned. The morning after I finalized the purchase, I drove back to the neighborhood just before 8 o'clock because I wanted to see an ordinary business day before introducing myself to anyone connected with the property. The parking lot outside. The clubhouse was already half full. Landscapers were trimming hedges along the entrance. A delivery truck unloaded bottled water near the side door, and the property management office lights were already on. Everything looked efficient, almost rehearsed. I parked beneath a row of oak trees, stepped out with nothing more than my phone and a small notebook, and slowly walked around the exterior of the building. I checked the condition of the brickwork, the roofline, the air conditioning units, and the handicap access ramps. I was not there as a visitor. I was inspecting an investment. Before I reached the front entrance, Melissa pushed open the glass doors and spotted me from nearly 50 feet away. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. She walked directly toward me with the confidence of someone convinced that every square foot around her existed under her authority. "Can I help you?" she asked, although her tone made it clear she hoped the answer would be no. I smiled politely, just taking a look around. She glanced at my truck before looking back at me. "Are you visiting someone?" "No." "Are you a resident?" "No." Her expression hardened. "Then this is private property reserved for members and their approved guests." I nodded calmly. "I understand." She waited for me to leave. I did not move. Instead, I looked toward the clubhouse entrance and admired the recent exterior paint. "Beautiful building," I said. "Someone has taken good care of it." She crossed her arms. "You need to leave." I looked back at her. "Why?" She seemed surprised that anyone would ask such a simple question. "Because I am instructing you to leave." Based on what authority? That single question changed the rhythm of the conversation. Instead of answering directly, she began listing bylaws, community rules, and board policies. She spoke confidently, almost mechanically, quoting section numbers that she clearly knew by memory. I listened without interrupting. Every few seconds I nodded as though I were attending a seminar instead of being confronted. When she finished, I simply asked, "Do those rules apply to everyone who steps onto this property?" She answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." I thanked her for clarifying. She frowned, clearly expecting an argument that never came. A maintenance employee walked past carrying a ladder and offered me a friendly nod before disappearing inside. Melissa immediately stopped him and asked whether he knew me. He shook his head. She instructed him not to let me enter the building under any circumstances. I quietly made another note inside my notebook. It was not about her attitude. It was about her assumptions. She never asked why I was there. She never asked whether I represented the owner. She never asked whether there had been a recent ownership transfer. She simply assumed that authority belonged to the loudest voice holding a clipboard. Before I walked back toward my truck, I thanked her again for her time. She looked almost confused by how calm I remained. As I opened the driver's door, she called after me with one final warning. "If you come back again without permission, I will involve law enforcement." I looked over my shoulder, smiled politely, and said, "That is your decision." Then I drove away knowing she had just taken the first step toward creating exactly the paper trail my attorney had predicted. When I got back to my office that afternoon, my attorney, Daniel Brooks, was already waiting with 2 cups of black coffee and a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. He looked up as I walked in and immediately recognized the expression on my face. "They took the bait, did not they?" he asked. I smiled, set my notebook on the conference table, and slid it toward him. Every page contained nothing but dates, times, direct quotes, and observations. No opinions, no emotion, just facts. He read silently for several minutes before nodding with quiet satisfaction. "Perfect," he said. "Do not respond. Do not correct them. Let them keep believing the story they have already created." That advice sounded strange to anyone who had never handled commercial property disputes, but experience had taught both of us the same lesson. The person who rushes to explain usually interrupts the other side while they are still making mistakes. The person who waits often receives evidence without asking for it. Over the next several days, I visited the property 3 more times, always during normal business hours, and always behaving exactly the same way. I parked legally, walked around the exterior, examined maintenance issues, and wrote notes about lighting, drainage, roof access, and landscaping. Every visit ended with Melissa appearing from somewhere inside the clubhouse as though someone had installed an alarm that activated whenever I entered the parking lot. Each conversation followed the same predictable pattern. She demanded to know why I was there. I answered politely that I had business concerning the property. She insisted I leave immediately. I thanked her for her concern and calmly walked back to my truck. The conversations never lasted more than a few minutes, but each one revealed something new. She became more confident every day because I never argued with her. Confidence without verification has a way of growing louder. By the end of the week, she was no longer asking questions. She was making declarations. She told maintenance employees not to speak with me. She instructed the management office to refuse any documents I might deliver. She even informed several residents that an unidentified outsider had been attempting to interfere with community operations. Ironically, every instruction she gave made its way back to me through ordinary conversations with contractors and vendors who simply assumed I was another representative involved with the property. Nobody realized they were quietly describing how the clubhouse was being managed to the person who now owned the building itself. Late Friday afternoon, Daniel called me after reviewing another batch of public filings that had finally been indexed by the county recorder. "Everything is officially visible now," he said. "Anyone performing a proper title search can see the ownership transfer." I looked out my office window at the city traffic moving below. "Do you think they have checked?" I asked. He laughed softly. "If they had checked, you would not have received another warning." Right on cue, my phone vibrated with an email forwarded by the property management office. Attached was a formal notice signed by Melissa Crawford demanding that I stay away from the clubhouse and warning that law enforcement would be contacted if I returned. I read every word twice before placing the printed copy inside the same white envelope that already contained the recorded deed, the executed closing documents, and the fully assigned lease agreements. Then I closed the envelope, locked it inside my briefcase once again, and quietly circled one date on my calendar. Monday morning. Sometimes the most important move in a legal dispute is not the first one. It is simply allowing the other side enough time to prove exactly how certain they are before reality finally arrives. Monday arrived with a cloudless sky, warm air, and the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from knowing every signature has already been recorded before anyone else realizes the game has changed. I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot a few minutes before 9 o'clock and parked in the same space I had used during each previous visit. Nothing about my appearance had changed. The same pickup truck, the same boots, the same plain button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to my forearms. The only difference was the white envelope resting inside my briefcase, waiting for the right moment instead of the first moment. As soon as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I noticed several board members arriving for what appeared to be a scheduled meeting. Melissa saw me almost immediately through the clubhouse windows. She pushed open the front doors with obvious frustration and walked toward me faster than she had during any of our previous encounters. "I warned you not to come back," she said before she was even close enough for a handshake. I answered with the same calm voice I had used every other time. "I remember." She pointed toward the parking lot entrance. "You are refusing a direct instruction from the Homeowners Association." I nodded once. "I heard your instruction." She stared at me for a second as though she expected me to become defensive. Instead, I simply stood there, looking at the building with the quiet satisfaction of someone inspecting an investment that had finally reached the closing stage. Several residents slowed their morning walks to watch. A landscaping crew stopped trimming hedges. Even the property manager appeared in the doorway with a confused expression. Melissa took out her phone. "This is your final opportunity to leave before I call law enforcement." I looked at her and smiled politely. "That decision is entirely yours." She immediately placed the call. Less than 15 minutes later, the same two officers who had spoken with me days earlier pulled into the lot. The older officer recognized both of us and walked over with a professional but noticeably curious expression. "Looks like we are meeting again," he said. Melissa immediately began explaining that I had ignored repeated warnings and continued entering private property without authorization. She spoke with complete confidence, carefully repeating that I had admitted I was not a resident and not a member. When she finished, the officer turned toward me. "Sir, is there anything you would like to add?" I reached down, opened my briefcase, and removed the plain white envelope that had remained sealed through every conversation until that moment. I handed it to him without making a speech. He opened it carefully and began reviewing the documents one page at a time. First came the recorded deed, then the assignment of ownership, then the executed lease agreements bearing county, recording information, and notarized signatures. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked back at the property, then at the address printed across the documents, then finally at me. The younger officer stepped closer to read over his shoulder. Neither man said anything for several seconds. Melissa folded her arms impatiently. "Well?" she asked. The older officer closed the folder, looked directly at her, and spoke with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "Ma'am," he said, "these documents indicate that Mr. Ethan Walker is the legal owner of this building." The silence that followed was louder than any argument either of us could have made. Melissa blinked twice as though the officer had spoken a language she did not understand. "That is impossible," she said, forcing out a nervous laugh that nobody else joined. She immediately reached for the folder in the officer's hands, but he kept it steady while turning another page to verify the county recording information. The younger officer quietly read the legal description aloud, matching the parcel number against the address mounted beside the clubhouse entrance. Every number matched perfectly. The property manager standing in the doorway slowly stepped outside, his face draining of color as he recognized the corporate names printed throughout the lease assignment. He looked at me, then at Melissa, then back at the documents before whispering, "Those are our lease records." Melissa shook her head. "There has to be some mistake. The board controls this building." I finally spoke, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "The board manages community operations. Ownership and management are not the same thing." Daniel Brooks arrived only a few minutes later carrying a slim leather portfolio. He greeted the officers, introduced himself as my attorney, and handed over certified copies of the closing documents along with the recorded assignment of the commercial lease. There was nothing dramatic about the exchange. No raised voices. No speeches. Just paper, signatures, and dates that had already become legal history before anyone in the neighborhood realized a transaction had taken place. Daniel then turned toward the property manager with a professional smile. "We attempted to deliver notice through normal business channels last week," he explained. "Unfortunately, those communications were declined before reaching the appropriate office." The manager slowly nodded as though several confusing conversations from the previous week had suddenly begun making sense. Melissa immediately interrupted. "You cannot just buy our clubhouse." Daniel answered politely. "The transaction was completed through the previous lender after a lawful commercial sale. The recorded documents speak for themselves." One of the board members who had been standing quietly near the entrance finally stepped forward. "Melissa," he asked carefully, "did anyone verify the ownership records after receiving those notices?" She hesitated for the first time since I had met her. That silence answered the question more clearly than any explanation could have. The older officer handed my documents back to me with both hands. "Sir," he said, "thank you for your patience. From what we have reviewed, this appears to be a civil property matter, and your documentation establishes legal ownership of the structure." Then he turned toward Melissa with the same professionalism. "Ma'am, I would recommend consulting your legal counsel before taking any further action concerning access to this building." Around us, the small crowd that had gathered no longer whispered about an outsider refusing to leave. They whispered about how nobody on the board had known who actually owned the clubhouse. I noticed residents looking toward Melissa with questions instead of confidence. The certainty she had worn like armor all week began disappearing under the weight of a simple fact that could not be argued away. She had relied on assumptions. I had relied on recorded documents. Before leaving, Daniel handed the property manager a sealed envelope marked as a formal legal notice regarding future communications, lease administration, and a scheduled review of contractual obligations. I watched him accept it without resistance this time. Sometimes justice does not arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives the moment everyone in the room realizes the quiet person they dismissed had been following the law, while everyone else had only been following habit. The legal notice reached every board member before the end of the week, and for the first time since I had entered the neighborhood, nobody treated it like another routine piece of paperwork. Daniel had prepared it with the precision I expected from him. It did not contain threats or dramatic language. It simply outlined the existing lease obligations, identified the recent transfer of ownership, confirmed the proper point of contact for future property matters, and requested a complete review of maintenance records, insurance certificates, vendor agreements, and financial reports. Connected to the clubhouse. Everything was written in plain English, supported by recorded documents, and delivered through certified mail. There was nothing emotional to argue with because facts do not become less accurate when someone dislikes them. Within days, the property management company requested a meeting. Their regional director arrived carrying several binders that had apparently not been opened in years. As we reviewed page after page, a pattern slowly emerged. Maintenance requests had been postponed without documentation. Vendor contracts had been renewed automatically without competitive review. Several improvements had been approved by the board without confirming responsibilities under the commercial lease. None of those discoveries automatically proved wrongdoing, but they demonstrated something equally important. Decisions had been made with confidence instead of verification. Daniel quietly highlighted every inconsistency while I listened far more than I spoke. The management company agreed to conduct an internal compliance review to ensure every contractual obligation had been handled correctly. News traveled through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement. Residents who had once waved politely without asking questions suddenly wanted answers. Several homeowners contacted the board requesting copies of meeting minutes and financial summaries. Others wanted to understand how ownership of such an important building had changed without their knowledge. At the next scheduled board meeting, attendance filled nearly every chair inside the clubhouse. I sat in the back beside Daniel without interrupting anyone. Melissa attempted to move through the agenda as though nothing had changed, but nearly every topic led back to the same question. Why had no one verified the ownership records after receiving multiple notices? One board member admitted he had assumed everything was already being handled. Another acknowledged that he had relied entirely on verbal assurances instead of reviewing the documents himself. The confidence that had once filled the room had been replaced by careful silence. Then the regional director from the management company stood and confirmed that the ownership transfer had been properly recorded and that future communications regarding the building would proceed through my office as required by the lease. No argument followed because there was no legal basis for one. Melissa remained unusually quiet for the rest of the meeting, occasionally turning pages that she no longer seemed eager to quote. Afterward, several residents approached me individually. They did not apologize because none of them had personally confronted me. Instead, they thanked me for remaining respectful throughout the entire situation. One elderly homeowner smiled and said, "You never raised your voice, even when everyone assumed you were wrong." I smiled back because that observation mattered more than any victory. Documents can establish ownership, but character determines how that ownership is exercised. As I locked the clubhouse doors later that evening after a routine inspection, I noticed the same freshly painted sign, the same trimmed hedges, and the same quiet streets I had admired weeks earlier. Nothing about the neighborhood had physically changed. The only difference was that assumptions had finally given way to verified facts. And once that happens, authority no longer belongs to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the truth that has been there all along. Nearly a year has passed since that Monday morning, and every time I drive through Willow Creek Estates, I still notice the same oak trees casting long shadows across the sidewalks, the same children riding bicycles after school, and the same clubhouse standing quietly at the center of the neighborhood. From the outside, very little has changed. The biggest changes happened where most people never bother looking: inside meeting minutes, updated lease files, revised policies, and county records that now match the reality everyone finally understands. The board reorganized after several members voluntarily stepped aside, choosing people who believed transparency was more valuable than appearances. The property management company introduced new review procedures requiring major legal documents to be verified before decisions. Affecting property rights were made. Routine inspections became exactly that, routine instead of personal. Questions became welcome instead of inconvenient. Even the monthly meetings felt different. Homeowners discussed budgets, maintenance projects, and landscaping instead of rumors and assumptions. Melissa no longer served as president. She quietly resigned after acknowledging that several important decisions had been made without confirming the underlying property records. I never celebrated her resignation because that was never the point. My goal had never been to embarrass anyone. It had always been to protect an investment while reminding everyone that confidence is never a substitute for facts. Several weeks after everything settled down, I received a handwritten note from the elderly homeowner I had watched watering his flowers months earlier. He thanked me for remaining patient when it would have been easier to argue. He wrote that the neighborhood felt calmer because people had started asking questions before making accusations. I folded that letter and placed it inside the same file that still contains the original recorded deed, the lease assignment, and every document that began this entire story. It seemed like the right place for it because, in its own way, it was just as important as any legal record. One afternoon, I walked through the clubhouse during a scheduled maintenance inspection and paused beside the large front windows where Melissa had once stood so confidently while telling the officers I had no reason to be there. Sunlight poured across the polished floor, and I could hear families laughing outside near the walking trail. I reached into my briefcase and found the now worn white envelope that had remained by my side through every conversation. The corners were bent from being carried so many times, but the papers inside were still perfectly organized. I smiled because I remembered the simple sentence that had confused everyone at the beginning. It had been completely true from the moment I said it. I was never a member of the Homeowners Association. I never needed to become one. Membership was never what gave me the right to stand there. Ownership did. There is a difference between authority that comes from habit and authority that comes from law, and eventually reality always separates the two. Whenever people ask me what I learned from the experience, my answer is always the same. Never confuse the loudest voice in the room with the strongest position. Read every page. Verify every claim. Let the documents speak before you do. Because in the end, I did not win by arguing, raising my voice, or proving someone else wrong. I simply waited for the truth that had already been recorded to arrive, and when it finally did, the very people who insisted I did not belong discovered that they had been standing inside my building all along.